He was born into a poor mining village in Soviet Georgia, a boy who learned early that tomorrow might not look anything like today. Bidzina Ivanishvili's rise reads like a novel of reinvention, a modest childhood in Chorvila, study in economics, then a bold move to the chaotic, opportunity-rich markets of post-Soviet Russia, where an eye for distressed assets and a willingness to take big risks turned him into a billionaire. He bought banks, metals companies, and stakes in telecoms. Where others saw rubble after the Soviet collapse, he saw the raw materials of empires and fortunes. Over a decade, he built a web of holdings and quietly but decisively a personal fortune that would make him Georgia's richest man and a central figure in his country's modern history. When Ivanishvili returned to Georgia in the early 2000s, he did not simply repatriate wealth. He invested it into the cultural and civic life of the country. Donations flowed to universities, museums, and public projects, and he founded the Cartu Foundation, a philanthropic vehicle that touched everything from the arts to sports and agriculture. These philanthropic gestures helped shape a public image that mixed benefactor and private eccentric. Extravagant purchases of art, large-scale gardening projects, and anecdotal stories of exotic animals and transplanted trees that fed a national curiosity about the man who had come back with money and power. But philanthropy was only one face of a far more consequential play. Politics arrived as the next stage in Ivanishvili's public life. In 2011, he founded Georgian Dream, a coalition built to challenge the entrenched rule of Mikhail Saakashvili and the United National Movement. Georgian Dream's surprise parliamentary victory in 2012 marked one of the most dramatic political shifts in Georgia's post-Soviet past. A billionaire-backed movement unseated the incumbent and opened a new chapter for the country. Ivanishvili briefly took the office of Prime Minister in 2012, a move that confirmed his mastery not only of markets and philanthropy, but of modern political mobilization. Yet his premiership was short. In 2013, he resigned officially, stating a desire to retire from daily politics, even as critics and analysts argued that he continued to pull strings from behind the scenes. That duality, public withdrawal, private influence, became one of the defining controversies of his era. To understand Ivanishvili's impact on Georgia, you have to hold two images at once: the billionaire who rebuilt libraries and hospitals, and the powerbroker accused by opponents of dominating the political system and resisting the country's westward tilt. His supporters point to stability, to the end of a hyper-personalized rule under Saakashvili, and to infrastructure and cultural projects funded by Ivanishvili's money. His critics see clientelism, pressure on independent institutions, and policies that, in their view, have shifted Georgia's foreign policy closer to Moscow, an especially sensitive claim in a country sitting at the crossroads between Europe and Russia. Protests, high-profile clashes with opponents, and charges of eroding democratic norms have punctuated the Georgian Dream years, making Ivanishvili both a builder of things and a polarizing political architect. The scale of Ivanishvili's wealth has been as much a public story as his politics. At the height of his fortune, Forbes placed him among the world's billionaires, with assets estimated in the billions of dollars. Later estimates and market swings saw that figure fluctuate markedly. Different outlets and indices have offered varying valuations over time, a testament to the opacity of asset structures, offshore holdings, shifting market prices, and the impact of legal and political developments on asset values. Whether you read a Forbes profile, a Bloomberg update, or other financial reporting, the headline is the same. This is a man whose private resources have matched, and sometimes dwarfed, the scale of the small country he returned to influence. But money and influence come with contestation. Over the years, Ivanishvili's name has appeared in international financial leaks and investigative projects that trace money, offshore structures, and the movements of assets across borders. Questions about undisclosed real estate, complex corporate vehicles, and the contours of his business network have fueled scrutiny both inside Georgia and abroad. At the same time, his proximity to power invited legal and political pushback. Opponents accused Georgian Dream of using state levers to stifle dissent, and international observers worried about the health of institutions meant to preserve media independence and judicial impartiality. The narrative of a national benefactor thus sits uneasily next to allegations about shadow governance and opaque financial practices. Ivanishvili's relationship with the West and with Russia is perhaps the most consequential part of his political legacy. Born and raised in Georgia, he made his fortune largely in the Russian economic sphere, a background that critics have used to question his geopolitical preferences. As Georgia navigates its ambitions to join Euro-Atlantic institutions, the country's leadership and policy choices are scrutinized for signs of drift. Some analysts argue that Ivanishvili's influence has nudged the country toward a more cautious, sometimes conciliatory position with Moscow. Others insist the picture is more complex, driven by domestic political calculations as much as external sympathies. The tension between Georgia's Western aspirations and its proximity to Russia remains the prism through which much of Ivanishvili's politics is read. High-profile legal battles have also marked Ivanishvili's recent years. One of the most significant involved claims against a major Swiss bank over forged transactions tied to life insurance policies. Courts in various jurisdictions have issued judgments and counter-appeals, producing a saga that stitched together allegations of forgery, recovered assets, and protracted litigation. At the same time, international sanctions and diplomatic pressures, including moves by some Western governments to curtail certain privileges, have complicated his legal and financial picture. These episodes have not only been about money, they've been events with reputational consequences and practical effects on how Ivanishvili's assets interact with global financial systems. If you listen to the stories people tell about him at home in Georgia, they oscillate between admiration and suspicion. There are tales of extravagant personal tastes, art auctions, rare trees, and sprawling estates where unusual animals once drew headlines, and of quiet largesse, scholarships, school refurbishments, and support for cultural institutions. Those who benefited from his philanthropy often speak warmly. Those who opposed his political style speak of an atmosphere in which patrons and power mingle in ways that can make impartial governance difficult. That double image, the eccentric patron and the controversial political force, is inseparable from Ivanishvili's public myth. To tell the full story, you also have to look at the mechanics. Ivanishvili's path from entrepreneur to political kingmaker rests on a few clear moves. Accumulate capital in fast-moving markets, return home as a benefactor to build social legitimacy, and channel resources into a political vehicle capable of winning elections. Georgian Dream wasn't built in a vacuum. It was the product of grassroots organization, media strategy, and yes, deep pockets. But it was also the product of a particular historical window, a Georgia hungry for change after a decade of one style of leadership and hungry for a different model of stability. The coalition won. Ivanishvili briefly led the government, then stepped down from formal office, while many believed he continued to shape the levers of power informally. That pattern, formal retreat, informal influence, is an important through-line in any attempt to understand his role. If you listen to the stories people tell about him at home in Georgia, They oscillate between admiration and suspicion. There are tales of extravagant personal tastes, art auctions, rare trees, and sprawling estates where unusual animals once drew headlines, and of quiet largesse, scholarships, school refurbishments, and support for cultural institutions. Those who benefited from his philanthropy often speak warmly. Those who opposed his political style speak of an atmosphere in which patrons and power mingle in ways that can make impartial governance difficult. That double image, the eccentric patron and the controversial political force, is inseparable from Ivanishvili's public myth. To tell the full story, you also have to look at the mechanics. Ivanishvili's path from entrepreneur to political kingmaker rests on a few clear moves: accumulate capital in fast-moving markets, return home as a benefactor to build social legitimacy, and channel resources into a political vehicle capable of winning elections. Georgian Dream wasn't built in a vacuum. It was the product of grassroots organization, media strategy, and yes, deep pockets. But it was also the product of a particular historical window, a Georgia hungry for change after a decade of one style of leadership and hungry for a different model of stability. The coalition won. Ivanishvili briefly led the government, then stepped down from formal office, while many believed he continued to shape the levers of power informally. That pattern, formal retreat, informal influence, is an important through-line in any attempt to understand his role. The past decade has tested Georgian institutions and society. Under Georgian Dream, the country has navigated economic reforms, regional pressures, and the complicated interplay between democratization and consolidation. International partners, from the EU to the US, have alternately cautioned, engaged, and pressed for reforms. The international reaction to Ivanishvili's influence has been a mix of diplomacy, conditional engagement, and at times, direct measures such as sanctions or restrictions aimed at curbing perceived abuses. For Georgia, the consequences are practical. Relations with Western partners, investment flows, and the health of the country's reform agenda are tied up with how power is exercised domestically. Ivanishvili's name, whether in headlines about philanthropy, legal cases, or sanctions, therefore becomes shorthand for the broader debates about Georgia's path. For all the controversies, Ivanishvili's influence on Georgia is undeniable. Infrastructure projects bear his stamp. Universities and cultural institutions carry benefits from his wealth, and a major political party exists because of his patronage. Yet influence is a two-edged sword. It builds, but it also invites backlash. In the court of public opinion, his legacy will be contested for years, alternately praised as the man who poured money and attention into a neglected country, and blamed as the architect of a system that blurred lines between business, philanthropy, and political control. How Georgia remembers him will depend on outcomes yet to unfold: the resilience of its institutions, the results of legal proceedings, and the choices of a new generation of leaders and voters. In the end, Bidzina Ivanishvili's story is larger than any single headline. It is a study in how wealth can be translated into influence, for better and for worse. It is a case study of post-Soviet transformation, where fortunes made in the footnotes of history can reshape national politics. It is personal biography and national saga, eccentricities in courtrooms, philanthropy, and political machinery. For Georgia, the Ivanishvili years have been formative, a period when the lines between private ambition and public life were redrawn, and the stakes of those redrawings continue to shape the country's future. So who was he? A builder of banks and businesses in the wildest days of post-Soviet markets, a patron of culture and education back home, the founder of a political force that changed Georgia's trajectory, a figure of controversy who drew scrutiny for opaque assets and political influence, and who faced legal and diplomatic challenges that reverberated beyond Georgia's borders. His life is a reminder that in our global, connected age, a single individual's fortunes can ripple across economies, institutions, and nations, and that the boundary between private wealth and public power is often where the most consequential dramas play out. If you're telling this story to your viewers, the lesson isn't a simple moral. It's a complex question about how societies hold power to account, how philanthropy interacts with politics, and how a country chooses its course when a single name carries enormous weight. Bidzina Ivanishvili changed Georgia, materially and politically, and whether history judges that change as progress, regression, or a bit of both will depend as much on the next chapters as on the ones we've already read.